Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the third week of Red May Resource Radicals with Thea Riofrancos and Vanessa Freije. Before we introduce the show, I'd like to, first of all, let you know what else we have on tap. We've got, I don't know, about 15, 20 programs left. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Set the World on Fire, LA in the 60s with Mike Davis, John Wiener, and Magali Miranda Alcazar. On Wednesday at 5 p.m., Capital is Dead, This is Something Worse. Mackenzie Wark with responses from Jasper Burns and Alexander Zevin, and Wendy Liu is moderating. And I can't remember what's on Thursday, but I'll tell you after the program here. What I really want to get to is money. I always have to talk about money, and I never know a good way to do it, but we need money to keep this going, particularly this year when we have all these plane fares that we're trying to get back from the airlines, who are just bailed out by everybody. And so that we can keep doing our vacation from capitalism, our month-long vacation of capitalism, where we pretend that the market's not the solution to the problems the market creates, but you don't really have to pretend when you see that it can improvise a public health service with just-in-time production. So for all those reasons, it's important that Red May keep doing its program every year and creating this one left month, left space a year in Seattle. And the way to do that is to go down to the description of the event, and you'll see something on the YouTube. You'll see something saying donate, and click on that and be generous, think warm thoughts about us. We appreciate it. But now I would like to introduce our protagonists for tonight, or at least one of them. Resource Radicals is a book by Thea Riofrancos, and Thea is going to be interviewed by Vanessa Freije, Assistant Professor of International Studies at the University of Washington, and author of a new book also coming out from Duke called Citizens of Scandal, about journalism and democracy in Mexico. I'll turn it over to Vanessa.
Thank you, Philip. And thank you so much for organizing Red May amidst a global pandemic. I've had the pleasure of participating in person in the past. So it's odd to not be able to see the other audience members, but thank you to those who are out there and are joining us tonight or this afternoon. So as Philip said, I will be in conversation with Thea Riofrancos today, talking about her book that's forthcoming this summer, Resource Radicals, that will be out with Duke University Press. So Thea Riofrancos is an assistant professor of political science at Providence College. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, N+1, Jacobin, Boston Review, Dissent, and In These Times, as well as in academic journals. She serves on the steering committee of DSA's Eco-Socialist Working Group, and she is the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and then, of course, of this forthcoming book that we're going to talk about today. So before getting into this conversation, I want to give a brief introduction to Thea's book, and of course, she'll also provide much more detail about her book as we move forward. But Resource Radicals addresses very complex questions that face the left in Latin America and beyond. The book explores the tensions between what Thea calls the left in power and the left in resistance, which really came to a head in Ecuador, which is the site of her study, under the administration of Rafael Correa. So Correa was part of the Pink Tide. This saw a wave of leftist governments come to power in Latin America beginning in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So many of the leaders of the Pink Tide, as many listeners probably already know, intensified export-oriented resource extraction with the idea of mitigating poverty and distributing benefits to their citizens. But as Thea Riofrancos writes, this commodity-dependent leftism was a double-edged sword. So her book shows how at the same time that the export of natural resources was reducing poverty, it was also contingent on the subjection of indigenous communities, often violent displacement, and obviously the contamination of fragile ecosystems. So this book is based on extensive archival research, ethnography, and over 100 interviews, and it explores the conditions and consequences of the radical politicization of resource extraction. Thea explores the emergence of a radical anti-extractive movement in Ecuador and seeks to explain why anti-neoliberal activists began to protest against a leftist government. So with that introduction, what we'll be doing going forward is I'll ask Thea a few questions. We'll have a conversation for maybe 40, 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and hopefully be able to have some back and forth that way. So my first question wants to turn to the tension that's really at the heart of this book. So the book really centers on this tension between the rights of nature and indigenous territories, and then the reality that oil extraction in many ways has contributed to the reduction of poverty in many Latin American countries, particularly the way in which it was mobilized in the last 2 decades. So Thea, you refer to these two positions or these two stances towards extraction as, on the one hand, anti-extractivism and radical resource nationalism. But collectively, you refer to them under the umbrella of resource radicalism. So I want to know why is it important for us to think about these two radicalisms together?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And thank you also for the summary, which I think helps situate folks that haven't read the book yet. No one else has because it's not for sale yet. So, but thank you for that generous summary. I want to sort of step back and zoom out a bit and just start with saying that Latin America has this very long and fascinating and oftentimes inspiring history of what I would call radical resource politics. Contentious politics where people from below, whether it's workers or communities or left-wing movements, contest the prevailing regime of resource extraction. And we could say that this kind of long history of conflict over extraction dates to a certain extent from the moment of conquest, like from the late 15th, early 16th century, when Latin America was violently inserted into the world system through conquest, and since then has, to greater and lesser degrees, occupied a peripheral position in that global economy as a region primarily dependent on exporting raw materials. So there's this sort of long history of resource dependency, we might call it. We'll sort of question that terminology maybe a little bit later in the conversation, and of conflict over that. And this conflict, I would say, really accelerated in sort of the long 20th century. So in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, we had the first kind of movements, popular movements, but also left governments directly demanding that the nation or the demos or sort of popular sector groups should directly control resource extraction, as opposed to what had been the norm and in many cases continues to be the norm of foreign capital controlling investment and development in these sectors. So that's sort of one way to see radical resource politics, this long-standing demand for popular control over resource extraction against foreign ownership. And this demand is often couched in terms of sovereignty, that like the problem with Latin America's position in the global economy and its relationship to foreign capital is that Latin American countries, and especially like Latin American people, do not have full sovereignty and control over extraction, and therefore over the entire economic model, since it's so fundamentally based in an extractive model of accumulation. So that's kind of one set, and I refer to that as radical resource nationalism because so often that's couched in the register of national control, whether that's conceived in democratic or more statist terms, but that's the kind of language that's used. Then there's this second resource radicalism, which Vanessa referred to, which focuses less on the question of ownership and more on the way in which extractive projects, whoever owns them, right? So whether it's foreign capital or whether it's a state-owned company, whoever owns them, negatively affect the environment, negatively affect indigenous communities, negatively affect local culture, and just kind of destroy the environments and the cultural landscapes in which those projects take place. And so this focuses much more on the sort of lived effects of extraction from the point of view of the communities most affected by extraction. This also is an anti-imperial critique, just like the first one. But again, it doesn't see the solution in terms of changing who owns the project or who is in charge of the economy writ large, but rather thinks of it in terms of kind of escaping and transcending the extractive model of development. So instead of the state or the people owning extractive projects and extractive firms, what we should have instead is a post-extractive transition. So this is this other kind of critique of extraction. What's kind of interesting is that despite the fact that I just teased out the differences between them, and Vanessa rightfully, as my book does, sort of counterpose them as two different left critiques of extraction, for many years, these two positions were not counterposed. They were not distinguished from one another. They were just different strains of radical critiques and radical alternatives to the prevailing model of accumulation. And again, the prevailing way that Latin America was inserted into the sort of global system. So you could have side by side movements that focused more on the question of ownership or the question of labor rights or labor control or national control, and movements that focused more on the way that extraction degrades local landscapes and affects indigenous territorial rights and indigenous culture. And I would say that especially during what we might term the height of neoliberal hegemony, meaning the sort of period of the 90s through early 2000s, when most governments in Latin America were neoliberal, and Latin America had embraced, across the board, Latin American governments under pressure from the IMF and also from the domestic ruling class had embraced neoliberal policies. These two critiques could coexist because both of them saw a common enemy in neoliberalism. When it gets sort of complicated, but also I think quite interesting, is once the left comes to power. Because then the question is posed, like, what should the left do with resource extraction? Should the left simply, or I don't want to say it's simple because this is not simple at all, but kind of straightforwardly in a sort of classical Marxist or classical kind of left sense, like just demand state ownership, or maybe more radically sort of democratic and popular and worker ownership? Or should it seek transcending the extractive model of development altogether? So not just swapping who the owner is, but instituting an entirely new model of accumulation that also would have really broad ramifications for the relationship between society and nature, between culture and economy, the question of what is democracy, really sort of maybe even a deeper transition that's not just changing who owns things. And so once the left comes to power, and Ecuador is the example of Correa coming to power in 2007, but depending on the country, and as Vanessa outlined, there were like tons of left-wing governments that came to power from Chavez in 1999, and the height of it was around 2010, when 2/3 of Latin America lived under a left-wing government. I mean, it's kind of amazing to imagine, like an entire region really governed by the left. So when that happens, the left faces this question of what do we do about the extractive model of development? And this question gets even more fraught by the fact that the left comes to power totally coincidentally, just like an interesting coincidence of history, during the commodity boom, which Vanessa also alluded to. So they come to power not only sort of bringing forward this historical lineage of radical resource politics, but also in a moment where resources like oil and copper and gold and soy and beef and all of these things that Latin American countries export, we're seeing historically high prices on the global market. And the reason for that has to do with, and viewers may be familiar with the story of exponential Chinese growth and China kind of also helping to lift the global economy out of the last global financial crisis, and that drove a lot of demand for primary resources to feed Chinese industrialization, but also Indian and Russian and Brazilian and the sort of emerging markets and how they were industrializing. So the left comes to power with resources already being deeply politicized, but also with this historic opportunity to use these really high prices for their exports to totally transform the situation in terms of poverty and employment and nutrition and housing and education and these other longstanding social demands. Because of course, it wasn't like the only social demands were, what do we do with natural resources? There were also these all these other demands connected to that around like, how do we ensure a dignified livelihood for all? And governments felt rightfully that they had campaigned on promises to ensure dignified livelihoods, and that they needed to respond to that, and that they had this opportunity. So what ended up happening, and I'll sort of wrap up here because we have lots more questions that will delve into this, but these governments took advantage of that opportunity in ways that we could think of as rational and strategic and logical, that they used this moment of historically high prices to in some ways double down on this extractive model of development, and use the resulting historic revenues to fund all of these forms of social spending and public works project. And the result is just like amazing. Like even the World Bank and the IMF, like these historic enemies of the left, like lauded some of the results because so many people were pulled out of poverty. I mean, it's just like, what's very upsetting right now is the way that, for various reasons that we'll get to later, there's a lot of reversal of some of those gains because of what we're seeing unfold across the world. But it should not, it should not be sort of left aside that like there were just tremendous gains, not just in terms of poverty and inequality, which and Latin America is one of, if not the most unequal region in the world. So there are tremendous gains there. There were also tremendous gains in terms of housing security, in terms of nutritional security, in terms of sanitation, in terms of internet connectivity. Like every single metric of human development was improved under the left in power. Of course, there were things that the extractive model, negative effects that then the extractive model also posed. So it did all of these good things, but it also, as Vanessa said, subjected particular territories to tremendous environmental degradation and violence in terms of displacement of indigenous and other directly affected communities. So that's one kind of cost of the extractive model of development. We'll get into this a little bit later, but it also was not an economically sustainable model, though it was for many years. It ultimately had an end when the commodity boom ended. So just to sort of close this out, when the left came into power, these two different critiques of extraction for the first time in history, and very dramatically in the case of Ecuador, though there are parallels with some other countries in the region, came into mutual opposition. So for the first time, socialism meant one thing and environmental and indigenous rights meant a different thing. And they were mutually opposed, and apparently, and I would say apparently, because I think we can question whether, this is the case, on a deeper level, but they appeared to be zero sum. Like you could do one or the other, but not both. And what Correa called, and Chavez and Morales called 21st century socialism seemed to be at the cost of indigenous rights, at the cost of indigenous sovereignty, and at the cost of environmental integrity. And this conflict became quite violent. At the end of Correa's 10 years in power, there was a state of emergency imposed in a province in the Amazon, and there was extremely violent displacement of Shuar communities in order to make way for a Chinese-owned mine, right? So these conflicts were not just rhetorical; they were not just different political positionings. They were violent and concrete and very palpable for people. And what I think I try to show in the book, and I'll end with this, is that the conflict between these two different left critiques of the extractive mode of development and alternatives to it raise what I think are very interesting questions about democracy, about economic development, about state formation, about the territorial basis of the state, and also about the ecological foundations of global capitalism that I think there are lessons and thoughts and insights that travel beyond Latin America.
Yeah, that's such a great setup to the problems of the left, or the problems and promises of the left in Latin America at the turn of the century. And I mean, the way you set it up also has reminded me just how incredible it was that the left did take so much, or did control so much territory in Latin America for a few decades, or a little under 2 decades. And now we have sometimes very short attention spans because this right-wing wave has come back, and it's kind of, that memory is short-lived. But one of the epigraphs that opens your book really nicely sets up the kind of official or administrative or government view towards those who opposed extraction. I think really nicely kind of captures the ways in which those arguments were dismissed. So I just want to quote from it. You have this quote from then President Rafael Correa, saying it would be madness to, quote, say no to natural resources because it's the only way, according to him, to eliminate poverty. But your book also makes an interesting intervention within the field of political science, because even as Correa was making this argument, there's this, I think, this idea of the resource curse that I think has kind of expanded beyond the boundaries of the academy to be something that many people are familiar with, like this idea that countries that become dependent on extractive industries end up kind of perpetuating the problem of dependency, and then also are notoriously authoritarian in their politics, anti-democratic, rent-seeking. So they're able, instead of taxation, to kind of distribute resources as they wish, and that they end up either buying off their societies or repressing them into submission. So this is kind of, I think, you know, I'm not a political scientist, but this is my idea of what the mainstream idea is of the resource curse. And your book is really interesting for many reasons, but one of the arguments you make is you recognize that the governance of natural resources in Latin America has not adequately dealt with inequality, nor with the problem of dependency, but you nonetheless challenge many of the ideas that we have about the resource curse by expanding kind of the ambit of what we understand to be resource politics, and including grassroots activists into this, the study of extractivism. So can you elaborate how exactly grassroots activism changes our understanding of the resource curse? How does it change our understanding about the role that extractive industries play in dependency? And along those lines, if you can you tell us if Ecuador is unique in this regard, meaning do grassroots activists play a particularly important role in resource politics there, but maybe not elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a great question, because one of my favorite activities is hating on the resource curse, which I think is an extremely unhelpful framework to understand what is obviously a very fraught sector. I mean, I think that it's true that depending on primary resources poses a challenge to development and a challenge to democracy, but I don't think it's in the way that the resource curse framework understands that. I mean, one thing that I would say, and this goes back to some of your initial comments and then some of my responses earlier, is that the resource curse framework completely isolates individual countries or national economies from the global system, right? It, you know, and so it automatically, like, the only states that are so-called oil states or mining states or, you know, timber or beef states or whatever their primary export is, are the states where those resources are extracted and harvested. But what about the entire rest of the world that eats that stuff, that combusts that fuel, you know, that enjoys the textile or whatever it is, right? And so what I think, like, a long history of Marxists and world system and dependency theorists, but also on anthropologists that have traced particular commodities and how they flow across the global economy, have shown that, like, the global system is interconnected. So first and foremost, it doesn't really make sense to sort of single out certain countries as being afflicted by this curse, right? If there's a resource curse, you know, it's a symptom of global capitalism in a sense, I would say, right? And I think that there are ways in which these sectors are particularly volatile and leave national economies particularly vulnerable to the turbulence of global capitalism, right? But we need to have that global framework in order to understand that. And I love Timothy Mitchell's line in the beginning of Carbon Democracy, which is that all states are oil states, like in the 20th century, right? Not just Saudi Arabia, not just Venezuela, right? And to understand Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, you need to situate them in that geopolitical, imperial, and global capitalist context. But we'll go to Ecuador. And I just want to reiterate a couple things that you said. Since I zoomed out a lot, I want to kind of come back to your question, which is the idea that political scientists and other social scientists have is that if you are dependent on primary resources as the sort of motor of your economy, you're automatically going to be underdeveloped, you're going to be poor, you're going to have a unstable economy, you're not going to be able to provide for your people. I mean, and there's so many obvious exceptions to this that it already sort of just boggles the mind. Like, what about Norway? But also, like, Saudi Arabia is a wealthy place. So it's like not clear, what does development mean? Okay, development means this really specific idea of what, England went through in the 19th century. So there's just like a very specific understanding of development, and there's only one definition of it. And if you depend on oil, meaning if you export it, you're not going to be developed in the right way. So that's one. And this is kind of like a hangover from like modernization theory and these kind of ideas that there's only one path or trajectory to development. Then the other kind of complementary piece is that if you depend, i.e. export these resources, you're going to be authoritarian. And then there's like a million exceptions to that. There's so many obvious like democracies that export these resources. And there's a great book by Thad Dunning called Crude Democracy, which actually argues that Latin America has democratized and been stably democratic during periods of resource booms, which is like the exact opposite of what the literature would generally predict. But even these critiques, I think, don't really get at what I think is so wrong with this framework. And now I'm going to sort of more directly answer your question, which is that in this framework, civil society is basically absent unless they are there to show that authoritarian oil-funded governments repress civil society or co-opt and buy them off. But social movements and labor unions and kind of popular sector groups have like no role in resource politics. Resource politics for political scientists tends to just be about how elites manage resource rents in order to kind of keep themselves in power. But what I saw in Ecuador is that the kind of context or the terrain, I'll put it that way, of resource politics like involved all these other actors that weren't really in the standard story of this very elite centric resource curse theory. And that these other actors really challenged authority in many ways. Like they challenge the power of elites, both corporations and governments. And they challenged elites specifically by contesting extractive projects and by posing alternative models of development or democracy to govern their societies and to be sort of the economic motor of their economy. So it just automatically, as soon as I started doing field work, got much more complex than this idea that oil or minerals causes economies or causes societies or causes governments to just behave in certain ways. It turned out that actually resource politics is contested. And so there isn't like a single directionality that, if you depend on oil, you're going to become authoritarian or you're going to become underdeveloped. So that's kind of one piece of it. And then I want to speak a little more about kind of two more things, then I'll answer your question about, is Ecuador unique? One of the most common claims in political science is that that oil or mining dependent economies are bad for democracy. And this was the thing that I think stood out to me as the most wrong, because what I saw instead of oil and minerals in the case of Ecuador being bad for democracy is that during the commodity boom and during the pink tide, there was an efflorescence of new types of democratic practices. Some of those democratic practices were defined against extraction, like they were local communities saying, we should be in charge, we should be able to say no to extractive projects, but they were on the terrain of resource extraction, right? And they were articulated in the register of democracy, and they involved new types of democratic claims. And on the state side, national governments, because they were leftist and they were ideologically committed to a sense of participatory democracy, at times to advance extractive projects or for other policy goals, they also instituted new forms of participatory democracy at the local level. So what you had wasn't like democracy disappeared because of resource extraction, but rather that democratic practices and identities and institutions became a way for resource politics to get fought out and fought over. And so it was like much more complicated than resources being bad for democracy. The other thing that I noticed doing field work, and this became apparent to me the more and more interviews I did with state actors. I've talked a lot about social movements so far, but a lot of my book is also about what bureaucrats were doing and what policymakers were up to. And I learned through those interviews that state actors were very conflicted about the resource-led model of development that Ecuador had, that there were a lot of bureaucrats that were as critical as some of my activist informants were, or as I would be, about some of the real serious downsides, both environmentally in terms of indigenous rights and economic downsides to this extractive model of development. And their whole career was about, how do we transition out of this model? And they were like dealing with this really fraught problem of a transition, an economic transition in a post-colonial setting, which is in a very unequal world order, right? And how do you actually do that? And so even the state was not monolithic. And in fact, certain state actors embraced a rather radical critique of what they called extractivismo, of extractivism, of the system of extractive development, which is something that the resource curse framework could never predict. Like in that framework, the state is going to extract as much as possible in order to keep themselves in power, pay off the opposition, repress civil society, please foreign corporations or whatever, right? So the idea that state actors would actually have a reflexive stance towards extraction is not predictable by the resource curse model. And then the question of Ecuador, is it unique? I think it is in some ways. The way that once Correa came to power, or soon after he came to power in 2007, social movements very quickly kind of reoriented to be very critical of the Correa government. Like they had supported him, not without reservations, but they had basically supported his campaign for presidency, including the National Indigenous Federation and many other popular sector groups. But when he came to power, that honeymoon period ended pretty quickly. And so one thing that's unique about Ecuador is the degree of movement, of state society kind of polarization, or of like left in power versus left in resistance polarization, was particularly stark. But another thing I would say about Ecuador is that it's hard to compare, because I've also read a lot about the history of Bolivia in this regard, and Bolivia has a similar history of radical resource politics. But for various reasons, I would say in Ecuador, resource politics were just such a central part of the development of the left and of popular movements. And these two strains that I mentioned before, of sort of this left populist, like we should own the resources for the people, and this sort of idea of like an ecological and harmonious with nature alternative to extractivism. Both of those were just really deep-seated in social movements and in critical intellectuals in ways that gave them sort of discursive and intellectual resources to really politicize extraction under Correa. So I think that there are unique features in Ecuador. I guess one other unique feature of Ecuador that's very much worth pointing out to those that are not familiar is that the indigenous movement in Ecuador, I should say the National Indigenous Federation, the CONAIE, was considered by like scholars of Latin America to be the strongest, most effective social movement in perhaps the hemisphere during the height of its political power. And so the indigenous movement in Ecuador occupies a really particular place on the national political stage there. And key to the indigenous movement's mobilization and history and claim making has been the issue of extraction, because indigenous peoples have been the most affected by oil development and agribusiness and a number of other forms of extractive development in Ecuador. So I think that sets it apart, but I think in a way that reveals similar patterns, just in starker relief compared to the rest of the hemisphere.
Yeah, I think you've really effectively debunked the resource curse for us all. And I think your book does as well. I want to zoom in a little bit. I mean, we've been talking about kind of global scale, because these are obviously, and you make it clear in your book and also in this discussion, just how interconnected extraction is and how it can't just be boiled down to kind of a national problem. So I want to talk a little bit about your ethnography and kind of the type of research you did to think through these problems, because like you said, or you alluded to in your discussion of the bureaucrats, like you mentioned in your book that this is a product of 100 interviews or 100 plus interviews. And some of those questions, it seems like you're really able to get at by asking the same thing to hundreds of people and seeing how they react. But one of the kind of key moments or events, it seems, in this kind of tense, or I don't know if you want to call it a standoff, but in this tension between the two resource radicalisms was the March for Water, Life, and Dignity of Peoples, which I believe lasted about 2 weeks and began in the Amazon and ended in Quito in 2012. And you mentioned in the book that you participated in the entirety of the march, and you have some beautiful photographs from the march as well. Can you just to like zoom in to kind of give some texture to what it is that this activism looked like? Can you tell us a bit more about the significance of the march, its significance to anti-extractivism, and also just maybe a bit about your own experience of participating?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about this, because it's meaningful to me personally, because of my participation in it, and also I do think it was a very pivotal political turning point during the Correa administration. So Correa was in power from 2007 to 2017. He was re-elected a few times, was very popular while in office, and this march, which was from March 8th to 22nd, 2012, was like I think I can safely say it was the largest kind of left social movement opposition kind of mobilization process during the entirety of the time that Correa was in power. It involved the biggest numbers of people, and it really was it really drew out the fact that there was a deep conflict between the Correa administration and many of the movements that, as I said, had with reservation, but had supported his rise to power. But at this moment in 2012, there was a fundamental split between the left in power and leftist popular movements. And the march both was a product of that, but also exacerbated that intra-left conflict. And the march, as Vanessa just said, started in a small town in the southeastern Amazon, a town that would be directly affected by what was at the time a planned large-scale open pit copper mining project, and now is a project that is officially in production. It took a few years to construct, and now it is producing. So that what was the march sort of emerged as mainly locally affected communities, combined with the fact that the prefect, kind of the equivalent of the governor of that province, was an anti-mining indigenous activist, so that lent it some political support. It was mainly people who were affected by this mining project who wanted to stand up to Correa and say, we're tired of this extractive model of development. We're tired of being sacrificed for, the national good of extractive redistribution. We're going to protest this mining project. And so it started with, at dawn on March 8th with like a few hundred people. And I was there when it began, and I didn't have any expectations, and I don't think really anybody did, of how big it would become. But we kind of snaked through, and literally kind of in this kind of circuitous way, up from the lowlands of the Amazon to the sort of semi-tropical slopes of the Andean mountains, into the highland wetlands, and then into Quito. And that was 700 kilometers. And I just mentioned some of the ecosystems and landscapes that we passed through. And we did it on foot and through caravan. And in fact, we were initially meant to have chartered buses that social movement groups with the resources and through fundraising had chartered, but on like the week before the march happened, the Correa government passed some regulation that barred chartering of interprovincial buses, like some really specific thing to make that not doable. So instead, we had to walk a lot more than planned, and also caravan. So people brought their pickup trucks, their cars, their motorcycles, and we would just, when we got tired of walking or when the sun went down, we would hop onto the back of a pickup truck and get to our next destination. And it depends on the folks that are listening in, like what experience you might have of Latin America, but a lot of this was in rural landscapes. Like we went through some small to medium-sized cities, but until we got to Quito, we were not in any major cities. So we went through some really peripheral kind of zones of the country, and as we went through each place that we stopped, some social movement, usually a base community of the National Indigenous Federation, but sometimes other allied movements would host us. We would sleep on the floor of a community center, the floor of, you know, the headquarters of this indigenous group or that one, and we would be welcomed by that community, and we would set up, you know, a kitchen, and, you know, I don't know if people have experienced kind of outdoor protests and encampments. You know, there's a whole kind of social reproduction aspect of it, and so we were feeding ourselves, we were maintaining ourselves, and we were moving northward through space. But each place that we stopped, some group joined us. And sometimes it would be, you know, a small brigade of maybe 20 more people or 100 more people. But we grew and we grew because everyone stayed with us. So by the time that we approached Quito, a few days before we got to Quito, we were joined by comrades from the northern Amazon. So from a totally different direction, they joined us. They had not, and the northern Amazon is the historic, the place where oil has been extracted for the longest in Ecuador. So these are communities, both indigenous and mestizo, that have very intimate and long understanding of what oil devastation is like and have dealt with that and protested that. So they joined us, and people from the coast joined us. So we were like our own snake, but then we were joined from the coast and from the northern Amazon by groups that had not been on our whole journey, but really swelled our numbers. And so by the time we got to Quito, we were 25,000 people. And this is, of course, many joined in Quito as well, right? And so that includes the folks that joined in Quito, but we grew from 500 people to 25,000. And what that growth kind of did, it's not just like a mere quantitative thing of like adding numbers, though that's obviously important when you want to make an impression on a government or corporation that you have people power, numbers are important. But it was also the way that like snaking through these different landscapes and communities brought in new demands and new grievances and new visions for what a better Ecuador would look like. And so we ended up having, at some point, kind of partway through the march, and I recount this a bit in the book, we had to develop, and I say we because I was, more than just an observer. I was like a semi-participant in this, and that opens up a whole set of questions about ethnography and how to relate to subjects and to friends and comrades. But anyway, we developed like a set of demands, and they were so long, and we were like commenting like, there's 20 demands, this is too many demands, like no one's going to listen to a group that has like 20 different demands. But we had to have all those demands because like every community and movement and sector that had joined had a specific grievance, and there were commonalities, but there were also specificities. So there was a way that like our movement through space expanded our coalition. And then by the time we arrived, it was clear that the Correa administration, as left-wing and transformative and progressive as it was not addressing many of the long-standing grievances of communities in Ecuador. And so it created a very powerful image. And I just want to kind of end with one last point, which is that what was really interesting to me when marchers were debating, I guess the most interesting thing to me, in addition to the kind of landscapes and the broadening coalition, was the way the march was like this ongoing tactical strategic experiment. Because we didn't know how many people were going to join us. We didn't know how Correa would respond. We didn't know that the police were going to infiltrate us with undercover cops, which they did. We didn't know helicopters were going to follow. Like, we just didn't know what was going to happen. And it was very open-ended and uncertain, which meant that every day was an extremely intense day of not just marching and keeping each other fed and clothed and warm, but also like these tactical and strategic decisions. And like, how do we respond to each new attack? We would write like a blog of and translate. I would help translate into English, and we would try to do press stuff. And it was just every day was like a lot of decisions that had to be made. And I think the biggest decision was how to relate to the Correa government. How do you respond and critique and organize against and also push a left-wing government? And the way that movements ended up sort of temporarily or provisionally resolving that quandary, and this is reflected in the movement's 20-odd demands, was that the first thing that this movement claimed to be doing was to be defending the Constitution. And that was the way that they chose to frame in an overarching way, but also relate to the government. And the Ecuadorian constitution, the 2008 constitution, which was written under the Correa government with a lot of social movement input, is considered by constitutional scholars one of the, if not maybe the most progressive constitution in the world. It has rights of nature, it has tons of collective rights for indigenous and Afro-Ecuadorian and Montubian peoples. It's a very progressive document. But what's interesting about the way that the state-society conflict unfolded is that social movements very much came to claim the Constitution as their own against the government. And so rather than let the government kind of have the Constitution as like, oh, this is how progressive we are, the social movements would say, you're not living up to this document. And so the way that they finally framed the demands when we came together and made those decisions was, the first thing that we're going to say is that Correa has violated the Constitution. And we, the people, are actually the ones that are defending and enacting through our democratic practice, through our resistance, through our claims to sovereignty, indigenous and otherwise, we are the ones that are giving life to this Constitution. And it was like a really powerful way to frame these disparate demands, but also to show how complex and fraught the relationship between state and society are in a context of the left in power.
Yeah, I think one thing I love that you show in the book is also this constituent process that happens outside of kind of official government sanction. And so, but nonetheless uses the language and some of the kind of technical practices that would normally shape or define these constituent processes. And maybe we'll be able to, I see some questions coming in that maybe will allow you to talk a bit more about that aspect. But I wanted to ask you a bit about the question of technocracy. So obviously, what you just described is in really rich and beautiful detail is part of the ways in which these this extractivism or anti-extractivism is trying to use the language of the state and the law to bolster their demands, while also you show elsewhere in the book invoking other types of epistemologies against kind of the state's technocracy. But in response, the state is also basically using this language of technocracy to try to minimize the claims that are being made by these activists. Like, you know, basically saying that particularly my understanding is indigenous community members don't have the technical know-how or the education to actually be able to resolve these demands. So, you know, basically trying to frame extractive questions of extraction as technical ones rather than political ones, whereas you and the actors involved show very obviously that these are political questions. So, but beyond government claims that only those with information could decide how to proceed, you highlight this much thornier question that undergirded decisions about extractive projects. Specifically, you note that it's not just about who possesses the most technical information, but a broader question about who should decide the fate of oil and mining projects, as long as they're happening. So should it be the minorities who are directly affected, so those who are living close to these sites and really the feeling the environmental contamination most acutely, or should it be the national citizenry that may in some way benefit materially from these extractive projects, but live far away from them? And something I think the book does really well is dispel any idea that these are easy questions to resolve, or that it's a clear-cut issue. So if you don't mind, I want to quote you briefly. So you say, quote, "From one perspective, there is democratic justice in those most immediately affected deciding the fate of extractive projects. But from another, such local rights fragment democratic sovereignty and threaten the collective good of resource-funded development." So I guess practically and politically speaking, is there a just way to answer this question of who should decide? Not that, you know, ExxonMobil is asking us, but
right.
But when these questions do become questions that governments and people involved take sides on, like, is there a just way for these decisions to be made?
Right. And I think the ExxonMobil kind of aside is a useful one, because one would hope that like a left-wing government could address these questions and these dilemmas in a way that is distinct from, you know, a foreign capital or multinational corporations. But it turned out that it's not that easy to address, right, as you said. And I don't hope to offer an answer, though I think that I can add a little bit more to what I say in the book. One thing I want to say first and foremost, and that the way you pose this question actually kind of brought to mind for me, is that I think one of the very interesting things about the question of democracy is that, and the way that democratic participation and democratic claim making became so central to how conflict over extraction played out, is that, you know, I have a background in political theory, and I've read a lot of democratic theory, and it's just often so abstract. And like what you're kind of pushing me on is that, like, in the abstract, both of these seem reasonable. Like, it seems reasonable for the most affected, and there's a principle, there's a theory in democratic theory, like the most affected principle or whatever, that like the most affected should have democratic control. And then there's other ideas that like only the national demos is like, that's like the scale at which we can have democratic decision making. If every locality has its own decision, then we don't really have a national democracy. We have a bunch of local democracies, and there might be issues of like ensuring equity and civil rights, and that the same constitution is upheld. So, you know, in the abstract, we could see like logic in both of these positions. But what happened when I did field work is that, well, first of all, these very abstract principles were brought to life in this really like vivid way for me. And I realized that a lot was at stake in the answer to these questions, which is precisely what makes it hard to address or resolve. I guess one way to sort of reframe this slightly, reframe my own kind of presentation that you read out loud, is that it is the extractive model of development, which is a model of development, again, that's very reliant on particular extractive sectors, whether it's agricultural or whether it's mining or oil, being harvested and extracted and being exported, and those revenues coming back in and those being redistributed, right? So this extractive model of development fundamentally is uneven territorially. It has an uneven territoriality. And what that means is that there are particular places where the raw materials are extracted or harvested, and particular communities that are affected by that environmentally, culturally, socially, but also who labor in those fields and mines and oil rigs. So there are particular communities that most viscerally and directly are involved in the process of extraction. And then there's a much more diffuse geography in terms of the potential beneficiaries. And, you know, under neoliberal or right wing or other regimes, maybe just elites benefit, right? But in a left-wing context, many people that might be lower class or economically precarious, working class, lower middle class, primarily in cities, which is where the majority of the population is concentrated, they are beneficiaries of resource extraction, or not of extraction, but of the revenues and redistribution of those revenues, right? And so that disjunct between the localized negative, oftentimes negative effects of extraction, and the more geographically diffuse potential economic benefits of extraction are symptoms of this model of development. And this is what dependency theorists pointed out when they talked, you know, in the 1960s and 70s about the enclave, right? The enclave is like this little zone where extraction takes place that's totally disarticulated from the rest of the national economy, and is very challenging for national governments to actually govern. And so they end up being sort of captured by foreign capital in most cases. So this is the sort of territoriality of this model. And it's this territoriality that in an interesting way, under a left-wing government particularly, actually brings these two different political geographies kind of into tension with one another. Because again, under a right or neoliberal government, like none of the masses are benefiting, right? It's just the elites. So that's how those different critiques of extraction that I talked about earlier can actually align, like your environmental critique and your, you know, we are not getting the benefits economically of this critique, can both take aim at the same elites. But when the left is in power and the left is meeting the demands of a large part of the population, but still sacrificing the demands and the livelihoods of a smaller part of the population, this gets more fraught and more complex to resolve through democratic means. And so that's the first thing that I would say. And I think what that kind of points us to is that there isn't a resolution at the level of democratic principle. I think the only resolution would be through a transformation of the model of development towards a model of development that is not so fragmented and uneven territorially, and that doesn't pit the livelihoods of many against the livelihoods of maybe few, but it could be in many cases in Bolivia or Argentina with large indigenous and rural populations, it could be quite large. Maybe it's not 50% in Ecuador, but it's not a tiny percentage of people that are affected by these projects, right? So there are two democratic claims and they can't be resolved at the level of abstract principle. I think they can only be resolved if the economic model can somehow lift up the livelihoods of people across urban and rural lines, across indigenous and mestizo, across, you know, those who labor in the cities and those that labor in the countrysides. And that's the extractive model of development exacerbates that question of kind of territorialized conflict. You know, in theory, and we could get to this maybe in a moment, a different model of development wouldn't do that. I just want to add one quick thing to this, just to kind of connect this a bit outside of just the question of kind of an oil dependent economy, which is that a lot of these same questions occur in a lot of the stuff I'm working on now around renewable energy, right? Renewable energy, of course, is not toxic. It doesn't contaminate in the same way. Some of the production of the technology can be toxic, but you know, a solar farm doesn't destroy the soil or water in the way that that oil pipelines might. But you still get these kind of conflicts around like local livelihoods and local community decisions versus, you know, some kind of broader collectivity, even in the case of renewable energy. So I think these are things we need to grapple with, not just like as observers of like, you know, oil dependent countries that are somehow out there, but as questions that come up whenever sectors or economic models have this kind of territorial unevenness and give rise to these competing claims. But I think that, you know, there are visions and concrete proposals in Latin America right now that are really interesting for an economic model that we could kind of compare in a way to like the Green New Deal, to one that is both socially and economically just and doesn't, socially and environmentally just, that doesn't counterpose those, but that tries to sort of see how they're intertwined, that would not exacerbate these kind of regional and geographic inequalities, but instead would kind of enable a multi-territorial coalition, we might say.
Yeah, that's great. And I think your question of territoriality, I'm really glad you brought it to environmental issues as well, because of course the question of territoriality and who decides becomes that much more complex when we think about the effects, the global effects of extractive industries in climate change. And then the question of who's affected becomes infinitely broader and moves much farther beyond these extractive zones or enclaves, as you said. Well, we're at the point where I think I'll start taking some questions from the audience and then maybe use my privilege of asking you the final question at the very end. In part because some of the questions that are coming in are touching on things that you've started to reference. So I'll just ask you two now that I think you can probably address together. So one of the questions, one of the viewers wants you to speak a bit more about what role do corporations or corporate capital play in this conflict? So what kind of relationships do national and transnational corporations have with the left governments in Ecuador and maybe in neighboring states? And what role are they playing in these extractive economies? And then the other question that you might be able to touch on at the same time is kind of what is the class base or composition of the two wings of the resource radicalism that you're talking about? Or is there a distinction?
Yeah, great questions, really, because things that I have not addressed, but are, as you said, kind of very relevant to some of the things that we've already been talking about. So about corporations, I think the image in the US media, and to some extent in the kind of academic scholarship on the pink tide governments, was of a very antagonistic relationships between capital and the state. That, like, the left came to power, they're going to expropriate, they're nationalizing, they're raising taxes, they're raising royalties, they're doing X, Y, and Z. And I think that this is an image. I don't think it's completely, I don't think there's nothing to it, but I think that it's a vast simplification of what occurred, which was in fact a much more complex political economy that involved forms of state capital coordination and even political alliance in certain moments. And at the same time that of course there was antagonism, because you had the left in power and you had the left wanting to exert, the left in power wanting to use the state to exert more control over the economy. So you certainly had policy changes that resulted in the assertion of state authority over economic activities, but you also had a lot of working together of the state and capital. And I want to just to sort of put this in a little bit of historical context. So remember that the left came to power after a decade or two or three, depending how you count it, of sort of neoliberal hegemony in Latin America, a period that started really when the region was still being ruled by dictatorship. So we can think of Pinochet, for example, as a key emblem of this. But these neoliberal policies continued under democratic governments, again with a lot of pressure from the IMF as well as from regional and domestic ruling classes. So what neoliberalism did, among many other things, is very much reinsert Latin America into the global economy. There had been a period of time during the interwar and immediate post-war period where Latin America had undergone a sort of developmental or endogenous development of industrialization. Not every country, and I'm going kind of quick and dirty with this, but there were inroads made to sort of national economic development with a decent amount of state involvement. That model, called developmentalism or called import substitution industrialization, ISI, or endogenous development, for both internal contradictions and external pressure, fell apart starting in the 70s. And then, added to that the sort of the debt crisis and the IMF loans with their conditionalities. Basically, what happened in especially in the mid 80s through 90s is that Latin America sort of stops this process of protecting its industries, of internally developing, of industrializing, and kind of in a way goes back to the prior model of development that had reigned from colonialism through the early 20th century, which was one of just export of raw materials. That was, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, like how Latin America was inserted into the world economy. There was this brief deviation from that, but then we're like back fully integrated into the global economy, into global markets, right? Commodities markets, and also financial markets. And so the left comes to power with these economies, these national and regional economies fully integrated into global markets. And that really, the left does not like deglobalize. Like, it doesn't take Latin America out of global markets. So the left's development strategy is instead to try to get the most favorable terms of trade, the most favorable contracts, and use as much of the proceeds from those international sales towards lifting people up out of poverty as possible, but it is not to pull out of global markets. So first and foremost, what's important to understand to answer this question is that Latin America in some sense, stays within, even under the pink tide, the sort of neoliberal model of market integration. And that means that foreign capital, as well as domestic capital, of course, has a really important role in the private sector of these economies, and in a sense in the public sector through public-private partnerships, right? So these governments directly contract with and partner with foreign companies, but not exclusively foreign, in order to not just for extractive projects, but also to build roads and highways and dams, to build electric grids, to build refineries, to do all of these things. They are contracting with private firms. They are doing so through contracts that are more beneficial to the state and more beneficial, I would say, to the society as well. But they are not outright, for the most part, expropriating foreign capital and putting everything under state ownership. There are exceptions to what I'm saying. There were some partial nationalizations, some kind of forced divestments where the state would claim 51% or 60% of shares in a firm. So there were some kind of antagonistic moves, but based on what I'm aware of, and I've read a decent amount about this, like there were very few, let me put it this way, outright classical nationalizations or expropriations where the foreign company just left, like Mexico did to Standard Oil in the 1930s or something. Like that did not happen. The governments knew that in order, in a sense, to carry out their project of redistribution in the near term, they needed the investment to keep flowing. And in order for the investment to keep flowing, and given how long it takes to build up national or publicly or state-owned or worker-owned companies that can replace private and foreign capital, in the near term, that meant working with foreign capital, sometimes in more contentious and sometimes in more collaborative ways. And I just want to also note this other political economy piece that I think is important, which is that in a commodity boom, in a moment when prices are historically high for exports, the kind of the tension or the trade-off between the state versus the corporation is alleviated a little bit. So when you have more revenues to work with because prices are higher, firms will accept a like very high tax on windfall profits because like they're just making so much money and they want to do the project, and like it's actually a little bit easier for the government to force somewhat more onerous conditions on companies because the pie is growing. Like think of, this is something that some viewers might be more familiar with, like the sort of heyday of social democracy in the post-war period in both the US to some extent, but especially in Western Europe, where you had just amazing economic growth, and that allowed for redistribution without as much conflict and without oftentimes outright expropriation, because you can redistribute a growing pie without taking from wealthy people. And that's what Latin American governments did. So foreign capital, for the most part, remained in Latin America. The domestic ruling class actually, over time, the more intelligent members of that class learned that they actually benefited from the amazing growth that was experienced under these governments, and even from the fact that poor people had more money, because that meant they could buy things in the supermarkets and pharmacies and clothing stores owned by the domestic and regional bourgeoisie. So they actually benefited from this purchasing power, especially because it didn't involve, in many cases, increasing taxation, really. In Ecuador, it's an interesting exception because the Correa government, and I think they should be lauded from this, did increase the tax rate and made it more progressive. But in a country like Venezuela, the tax rate remained extremely low. So a lot of the redistribution was redistribution of resource rents coming from the external, from external markets, not from taking wealthy people's money or taxing them more, or taking their assets for the most part. So both foreign cap, there was a kind of like provisional alliance, that's probably a little too strong a word, but like kind of impasse or kind of mutual beneficial situation between foreign capital, domestic capital, and left-wing governments. But that ended decisively in 2014 when the commodity boom ended. Then we see that capital, that domestic and foreign capital are very fair weather allies, right? They were ready to pounce on left-wing governments as soon as the game got more zero sum and the pie wasn't growing so much. And we can maybe return to that with maybe some of our final thoughts. I can talk a little more about that regional conjuncture, but that's what I say about the corporation piece. About the class composition, it's an interesting and a complex question. I would definitely say that the class composition of the kind of populist, nationalist, leftism around resource politics is one that involves primarily the popular sectors. And I've used that term a few times without defining it, and I know it's not a term used so much outside of Latin America, but the popular sectors are the multiple groups of society that are historically excluded, historically marginalized, exploited, and oppressed. And in a context like Latin America, which had, as I just kind of described, a truncated process of industrialization, this is not primarily like the working class in the factories, though they're part of it. It's also the campesinos, the small, scale farmers and peasants laboring in the countryside. It's also now the millions and millions that work in the informal market, and that have primarily service sector jobs. Well, not anymore because of COVID and lockdown, but that's like the way that many people in Latin America that are lower class and lower middle class work. So the popular sectors are all of these people. They're also indigenous people and Afro descendants, people of color in the region that have historically been marginalized and dispossessed as well, on racial, ethnic, and class grounds. So those are the popular sectors, and broadly, those are the sectors that for a century or more in Latin America were at the vanguard of a sort of nationalist, democratic, left populist vision of how the resource sector should be governed, who should own it, and who should benefit from it. Things get a little more complicated with the other strain of radical resource politics, the kind of anti-extractive one, the one that says it's not about ownership, it's about just ending this extractive model of development and moving on to something different. It's definitely also primarily of the popular sectors. It's primarily both indigenous peoples in the countryside and to an extent in the cities, and also mestizo farmers whose livelihoods are also very much affected by the extractive model of development. So it definitely has its base and sort of the masses of it, though I don't think the masses are as big as that first group that I just described, or the first kind of leftism that I just described, but the masses of it are also from the popular sectors. But it also involves alliances with people that are, I don't want to say they're super elite, but they might be relative elites, like people that are, urban environmentalists, people that are maybe more middle class, people that are members of radical environmentalist groups, that do a lot of direct work and solidarity work with indigenous communities, with campesino communities, in relatively lateral and horizontal ways. But it's important to note that there definitely is a contingent of anti-extractive politics that is middle class, that is educated, and that is I don't want to say affluent because I think that would be inaccurate, but is not struggling to survive. And that has an ideological commitment to anti-extractive politics and to transcending extractivism that doesn't per se come from being directly affected. Though, of course, given how family and kinship works in Latin America, like they may very well have family members in rural communities who are directly affected, right? It gets really complex. And I think I'm sort of complexifying it on purpose because I think there is a simplistic image sometimes of like environmentalists being middle class. And I think that precisely what my book shows is that the masses of environmental movements in Latin America have been from the popular sectors, but there's certainly also middle class elements as well. So that's how I kind of break down the class composition of those two versions of radical resource politics.
That's great. Thank you so much. Another two questions asked you to talk a bit more about what kind of participatory democratic practices you look at in the book. And another question asked to kind of elaborate on the constituent process. My apologies. And maybe how that relates to the participatory democratic practices. And then there's this question of what's the state of these participatory democratic practices now? So like in the wake of Correa's departure and obviously the return of other right-wing governments in Latin America, are these practices changing or are they resisting in other ways? If you could just elaborate, kind of bring us up to the present moment as well.
Yeah, great. So the main democratic practice that I look at on the social movement side in the conflict over resource extraction in Ecuador is our consultations. They can be called popular consultations or community consultations. And actually, this relates directly to the other question about constituent politics. So in the Constitution, which I mentioned previously, is among the most progressive, if not, maybe the most in the region or the world. one of the key collective rights in that constitution, and it's a constitution that is hundreds of pages long, that is full of rights, like individual and collective. And one of the collective rights that's very much highlighted and important in the constitution, and was very important in the constituent assembly that wrote that constitution, is the right to prior consultation. And what this right lays out, and it's a right that is enshrined in various international legal norms from the ILO to the UN, and basically says that there are different versions of it. Some focus specifically on indigenous communities, some focus on any affected communities, but basically that communities that are affected by extractive projects have a right to be consulted prior to those projects being developed. And so you can immediately see that this raises a lot of questions, like what does consultation mean? What is the substance of consultation? What does prior mean? Does it have to be like before anyone even contemplates there being a project, or can the project be designed and then the consultation kind of happens after? So, and then there's other elements of this, that the full wording of it is free, prior, and informed consultation, but sometimes it's written as consent, right? So then it gets to another tricky part. Do you need the consent of the community? Does the community have veto power? Anyway, the Constitution lays out that communities, indigenous and non-indigenous in Ecuador, have the right to prior consultation, and it's relatively emphasized in the Constitution. The problem came in the sort of getting from the paper to reality. And according to the communities that I interviewed and observed, the government had not in good faith observed this right. And this is, by the way, a common kind of juxtaposition between the paper right and the actual practice in many other countries in Latin America that have this right, whether because they ratified an international treaty or convention, or because they have it in their domestic law. So it's actually quite common that many Latin American countries have this right on paper, but very few of them substantively enforce it, I'll put it that way. And that's both under right and left governments. And so what communities have done in response, and this isn't just in Ecuador, some of the most interesting politics around this are actually in Guatemala, where lots of indigenous communities in Guatemala have instituted their own community consultations as a response directly to the fact that the government is not enforcing the right and the corporations are not enforcing the right. And so Ecuadorian activists kind of learned in this regional milieu from Peru, from Guatemala, Argentina, lots of communities in these different countries were doing this. They picked up on this and they made it their own. We're going to institute in communities affected by potential mining projects, our own community consultations. We're going to consult ourselves, basically. And so this raises that fundamental question of constituent politics, which is the question of who rules, right? The people rule ostensibly in a democracy, but also there's a government. There's also the Constitution, and the Constitution will refer often to both the state and to popular sovereignty kind of outside the state. And these are, just for people unfamiliar, these are in democratic theory, this whole area of thinking about kind of who rules, who has power, is there power beyond the state? Is democracy about the state being democratic or about the people outside of the state being in control? All of those questions are discussed under the banner of constituent politics. And so what I saw in Ecuador was, again, these democratic theory debates like being brought to life in front of my eyes, and seeing communities really grapple with the question of like, who rules and how do we rule ourselves? Like, how do we actually participate in sovereignty when this key issue that affects our lives, which is whether or not an open pit mine goes up next to our community, contaminates our water, makes our agricultural livelihoods unviable, destroys this cultural or ceremonial site, displaces this village from where it currently lives violently, at the barrel of a gun in some cases. I mean, the army and these sectors are often highly criminalized, and like the extractive zones are highly criminalized as a way to make sure that the extractive activity goes forward. And so, the question of like, how do you get control over the conditions of your existence and what does democracy actually look like was really brought out in these amazing community-led processes of self-consultation. And so what they would do is organize a day, and it took a lot of organizational work, especially in rural communities that face a lot of challenges around mobilization and you know, internet access and all these things, like just to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page with what's going on, they would set up a day of voting, and each member, not actually each member of the community, but each member of the water association, the water and irrigation association in this case, that organized it, which was a lot of the community, but not the entirety. This is an agricultural community that managed its own water supply. So they had an organization that was actually state recognized, which gets, you know, adds another layer of complexity, that decided to hold this vote among its members. And like, I don't remember the exact number, of course, but 90-something% of the people that voted against the mine in question. And so then, you know, the Correa government pounced on this. This was illegitimate. This was not constitutional. The constitutional process is this. The government is supposed to regulate how consultation happens. Also, the government already consulted you at some point in the past, right? And so it brought up all these questions of like, who enacts democracy, and who is the people, and who, you know, who is sovereign. And, you know, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about these tensions between national and local understandings of democracy, but also around like, once you have a constitution, who ensures that those rights are upheld? Do we rely on courts and on the government and on bureaucrats, or can communities take rights enactment and enforcement into their own hands? Is that what actually democracy is? I mean, it's a fraught question, and I don't want to at all give the idea that like local control is always better, right? We have actually in the US, like states' rights and local control are often like right-wing projects, right? So I don't think that there's any easy political mapping of like ideology or political position onto scale of decision making. But in this case, the local scale was the scale of sort of left resistance, but against a left nationalist project. And it was kind of all organized through constitutionally laid out, but not actually enforced rights and institutions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of the questions that came up that I think is worth thinking about is you mentioned that from Latin America, there are actually kind of new economic models being imagined that are more socially and environmentally just. And I wonder if some of these will appear in the NACLA issue that you're co-editing over the summer, and if you can share some of those ideas with us now.
Yes, there are, and you know, actually, one of my one of the favorite things that I discovered when I was doing archival work, so not during my field work, but looking at sort of the archives of past political programs and platforms of social movements in Ecuador, that I discovered was this platform from 1994, I believe, of the National Indigenous Federation that called for a planned eco-communitarian economy, like planning as in the sort of classical left, like we should plan, you know, the economy and not leave it to market forces. Ecological, so inserting sort of an ecological critique of capitalism. Communitarian, so an idea that communities have control. And this is from the mid-90s, so it's sort of before that moment that these two resource radicalisms kind of split ways. I guess I'm just going back to history because I think there is a long and interesting history of proposals, of platforms, of demands that weave together the economic and the environmental, the social and the ecological, right? And don't see them as mutually opposed. And so there's a lot of interesting history to draw on. But in the current moment, what I've been really inspired by, and my guest co-editor, Daniel Aldana Cohen, we're working on this issue of NACLA for the summer together, is on these new, innovative, fascinating proposals, both from like progressive policymakers and from social movements and labor unions, around like what would a kind of Green New Deal, and that term, of course, is not always used in Latin America. It can be in Spanish, a pacto ecosocial, so an eco-social pact is sometimes the language, kind of like a social agreement that centers both social needs and ecological needs, right? So there's also the Nuestra América Verde, so like sort of our green America. There's a big push idea as well for sort of a new idea of economic development that also takes climate and environmental issues into account. So there's a lot of interesting ideas coming out. Of course, we're not in the best situation politically to implement all of them, though we're also not in the worst. And I realize I didn't answer some of that question about where we're at now in the region politically. There was a moment like a year or two ago where I was really depressed about regional politics, that it just seemed like the right had just come full force back into power, and an even scarier right wing than like 90s right wing, like, Bolsonaro, and of course like the coup in Bolivia. And it was just very depressing. But I actually, since then, AMLO, who I have plenty of critiques of, the president of Mexico, especially on environmental grounds, but I'll save that for another day. And then Fernandez in Argentina, who ditto, I have critiques of, trying to like keep fracking alive. Like I have critiques, but they are at least left wing, and they have therefore some responsiveness to social movements in the way that the right doesn't. So you have those two left wing governments in power. You also have progressive governments elsewhere in Costa Rica that are doing really interesting things. And so it's not so clear to me that the right wing's hold on power is so stable or hegemonic. I think we're in a period of uncertainty. So I think that there is political space for some of these really innovative ideas coming to the left to kind of have an impact. And then on top of that, we are in this extreme economic and health crisis. Of course, we barely even touched on that in this. I think I alluded to it briefly earlier, but it is a moment for the state to obviously be involved in the economy. I mean, the economy is not working without state involvement. So of course, there's serious constraints to that involvement. And when you're talking about the peripheries of the global economy, like they don't have the same ability like in the US to just, print money and to like not have to worry about international creditors and having, in the US, even though our taxation could be much more progressive than it is, like compared to Venezuela, it's more progressive, so we have more resources to work with and all the wealth in the US. So the US is in a much better position economically to fund a Green New Deal, even though, don't get me started on all the right-wing ideas that we can't afford it. But we obviously do. Where in Latin America, there are some serious constraints of global capitalism, of the position of the world economy, of the low taxation, all of these types of things. So it's challenging, but we're just in a situation where the government is going to be involved in the economy. And so it's actually a really good moment, I think, for these Green New Deal type proposals to kind of orient how that government involvement might take place. Of course, that will be somewhat easier in contexts ruled by left-wing governments. But I think even in contexts ruled by the right, in some cases, you have some subnational political power where provinces and cities can do things. But I think a lot of these right-wing governments, honestly, not very popular. And I don't see a lot of them per se winning re-election the next time around, especially given the way the pandemic is playing out. And so there might be a real political opening for the left in the coming years in Latin America. And so what's important is, as Milton Friedman said, and then Naomi Klein also popularized in the shock doctrine, like you have to have these ideas lying around. And then when they are able to be put into political practice, they're already there, and the sort of social consensus has already been established, rather than waiting till we get back into power to kind of formulate the policy proposal. So I'm hopeful, even through all of the tragedy and extreme devastation that's unfolding across the region, I'm hopeful that that again, progressive movements and policymakers and economists have not given up on the idea of like a deep left-wing transformation that is on better environmental footing than the prior one was.
I think that's a really hopeful and optimistic note to end our conversation on. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us and sharing your book with me. I highly recommend it to everyone in the audience, and I can't wait to see it in print. Thank you so much, Thea.
Thank you, Vanessa, for those amazing questions, and to the audience.
And I'll hand things back over to Philip now before we sign off.
And thanks to both of you. By a pure quirk of fate, we have the editors of 2 consecutive issues of NACLA talking to one another without any intention of ours at all. Vanessa, you have an issue coming out before Thea's on a foreign policy for Latin America. Do I get it right, or how would you describe it?
A people's policy of Latin America, or for the Americas, I should say. Yeah, rethinking hemispheric relations, kind of, rethinking our ideas of US foreign policy in the region.
Oh. And when is that out?
It was out in March.
Oh, it's out in March.
So there's an e-version and a print version as well.
Right. And Thea, you know, your book is fascinating, particularly in the way it deals both with political theory and the relation between the national level and the community, the constituent process in the community, and in political economy, where the nation is kind of stuck between the community and the world market. And, you know, I guess that is the question one has to ask. It's the old socialism or left populism in one country question.
Right.
You know, how much latitude do you have to get beyond public-private partnerships when you're surrounded by so many of these constraints, and yet all of these things, these pressures will bring it ultimately to fail, particularly when it's dependent on a particular commodity, which is only as good as long as it brings in revenues during a boom period. And when that turns around, you're back to the old question. But I like the way you detach it from the simplistic notion of resource curse, and even bring in Bakhtin in your book by this saying that words essentially, they're not educated at the level of an abstract level, but they always mean something else because people are using them to mean in different contexts and different situations. So I found the book spellbinding. I'm about 1/4 of the way through, and I highly recommend it. And I also want to say that the event I couldn't remember on Thursday night is another event that Thea is going to be on called Climate Crisis Through a Pandemic Lens with Nick Estes, Jeff Mann, and Holly Jean Buck. And Olafemi Taiwo is going to moderate. It should be very, very interesting. 4 different looks and perspectives on a Green New Deal, a Red Deal, a climate leviathan, as Jeff Mann's book talks about the potential political formations as the climate crisis intensifies. Lots of stuff to think about there. That's at 6 p.m. on Thursday night. Tomorrow, as I say, we have Set the World on Fire, which is at 2 p.m. Mike Davis and John Wiener talk about their new book with Magali Miranda Alcazar. And on Wednesday, we have Capital is Dead. This is something worse, a kind of provocative book by Mackenzie Wark with responses by Jasper Burns and Alexander Zevin. Wendy Liu is the moderator. That is, what time is that? That is at 5 p.m. On Wednesday. And finally, Friday, we have Racial Capitalism and Disposable Populations at 5 p.m. So a lot of stuff to do. Again, we're trying to raise $12,000. We're at $1,650 so far, but I'm optimistic. I think we can find it out there even in this current world market. So just go to the donate box in the description of the event and click on it and share what you can. Thanks very much. We'll see you tomorrow for a month of anti-capitalist events.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Vanessa and Phil and Sean and everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank
thanks
you,
a lot.
Thea.